Go home, old witch. Those were the first words I saw hanging above my granddaughter's birthday cake. When I walked back into the backyard carrying the small blue gift box I had spent 3 months saving for. I stopped so suddenly that the paper gift bag slipped against my wrist and nearly hit the ground. The banner stretched across the wooden fence in glittering black letters, swaying softly in the warm June breeze while pink balloons bounced around it like nothing was wrong. For a moment I honestly thought it had to be some cruel mistake. Maybe a prank meant for someone else. Maybe one of Chloe's teenage friends thought it was funny. But then I looked around the yard. Nobody seemed surprised. Not the caterer arranging cupcakes beside the lemonade station. Not the parents sipping wine near the pool. Not even my own son Daniel, standing beside the grill with a paper plate in his hand. The worst part was Chloe. My granddaughter looked directly at the banner, then quickly looked away the second our eyes met. No confusion. No shock. Just guilt. I felt something cold settle quietly into my chest. "Mom," Daniel finally said, walking toward me with an awkward smile stretched across his face. "You're back." Back. As if I had just returned from the grocery store and not from picking up the custom silver bracelet Chloe had begged for last Christmas after seeing it in a jewelry store window downtown. I forced myself to smile. "Traffic was terrible," I said softly. My voice sounded calm even to me. That surprised me most of all. Vanessa appeared almost immediately, her pale pink dress perfectly pressed, her blonde curls untouched by the humidity. My daughter-in-law always looked camera-ready, even during family cookouts. "Margaret," she said brightly, glancing at the banner for less than half a second. "Some of the kids thought that sign would be hilarious. Teenagers, you know." I looked at her carefully. Vanessa had perfected the art of sounding sweet while saying terrible things. It was a talent I had watched sharpen over 16 years of marriage to my son. "Of course," I replied. "Teenagers." A few guests nearby let out nervous little laughs before quickly pretending to focus on their drinks. I noticed something then. There wasn't a single chair left at the main table. 12 seats. 12 pink floral centerpieces. 12 gold name cards. Mine was missing. I stood there holding the blue gift bag while people avoided looking directly at me. The smell of barbecue smoke drifted through the air. Somewhere inside the house, music played too loudly. 15 years earlier, I had stood in a hospital room holding Chloe for the very first time while Daniel cried beside me because he was afraid to support her tiny head properly. I remembered promising myself that little girl would always know she was loved. And now on her 15th birthday, I was standing 10 feet away from a banner calling me an old witch while half the guests pretended not to notice. Vanessa suddenly clapped her hands together. "Okay everybody, cake in 10 minutes, she announced cheerfully. The crowd relaxed instantly, grateful for permission to move on. I looked down at the small blue gift box in my hands. Inside was the bracelet Chloe once said made her feel grown up and elegant. I had skipped buying a new winter coat last January to afford it. Slowly, carefully, I tightened my grip on the ribbon handles and smiled again. Because right then, standing beneath that banner while my own family avoided my eyes, I realized something important. Nobody humiliates you that comfortably unless they've been doing it quietly for years. I stayed for the cake. I do not know why. Maybe because leaving immediately would have given Vanessa exactly what she wanted. Or maybe because some stubborn part of me still hoped Chloe would walk over, hug me, and tell me she had nothing to do with any of it. Instead, I stood near the edge of the patio beside a large ceramic planter, while guests gathered around the long white table in the center of the yard. Chloe sat between her friends wearing a sparkling silver crown that caught the string lights every time she turned her head. She looked beautiful. Older than 15 somehow. Her blonde hair fell neatly over her shoulders, and her makeup made her resemble Vanessa more with every passing year. I remembered braiding that same hair before. Elementary school while she sat on my bathroom counter swinging her little legs and asking endless questions about heaven, butterflies, and whether dogs could understand birthdays. Back then, she used to call me every Sunday morning before church. Now she barely answered my texts. Vanessa carried out the cake with dramatic flair while everyone sang loudly enough to drown out the uncomfortable silence hanging beneath the surface of the party. I noticed Daniel glance toward me twice during the song, then quickly look away each time. My son had developed that habit years ago. Looking away instead of speaking up. Looking away instead of choosing sides. looking away because pretending not to notice was easier than confronting the truth. When the singing ended, people clapped and crowded around Chloe with gifts. I waited quietly until most of the guests stepped back before walking toward her with the blue gift bag still hanging from my wrist. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said gently. Chloe smiled politely. Politely. Not warmly. Not lovingly. Politely. "Thanks, Grandma." I handed her the bag. Vanessa immediately leaned forward. "Oh my goodness, Margaret, you really did not have to buy anything expensive," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Teenagers lose jewelry all the time." I looked directly at her. "Some things are meant to last," I replied softly. For one brief second, her smile tightened. Chloe carefully opened the box, and her eyes widened when she saw the bracelet resting against the velvet cushion. "Grandma," she whispered, genuinely surprised. "This is beautiful." Hearing that almost hurt more than the banner, because beneath all the distance and awkwardness, I could still hear traces of the little girl who once fell asleep on my chest during thunderstorms. Before Vanessa could say another word, one of Chloe's friends ran over holding a phone. "Come on," she squealed excitedly. "We are taking family pictures by the pool." Everyone immediately started moving toward the backyard fountain where a photographer waited beneath an arch of pink roses. I followed slowly behind, still holding my paper plate untouched. The photographer smiled. Professionally, as relatives arranged themselves in rows. "Okay," he called out cheerfully. "Immediate family first." Vanessa slipped beside Daniel and wrapped an arm around Chloe's waist. "Perfect," she said brightly. Then she glanced at me over her shoulder. "Margaret, maybe stand over there for now. We will do extended family pictures after." Extended family. The words landed quietly, but they landed hard. I looked around at the people gathering near the pool. Vanessa's cousin was standing in the front row. Her sister's boyfriend was there too. Even a neighbor I barely recognized stood beside the fountain smiling for photos. But somehow I had become extended family. I stepped back without arguing. My shoes sank slightly into the damp grass while the photographer adjusted his lens. Nobody protested. Nobody said, "Mom should be in this one." Nobody even looked uncomfortable anymore. That was the moment I realized this was not impulsive cruelty. It was routine. Practiced. Carefully normalized over years, little by little, until excluding me felt natural to everyone there. I stood off to the side while the photographer snapped picture after picture beside the fountain. Every flash felt strangely distant, like I was watching someone else's family through a window instead of my own. Vanessa adjusted Chloe's hair between shots while Daniel rested his hand lightly on his daughter's shoulder, smiling in that tired, polite way he always did during social events. I remembered another birthday 15 years earlier when Daniel called me from the hospital at 3 in the morning because he was terrified Vanessa was going into labor too early. He had cried when Chloe finally arrived healthy and pink and screaming. "Mom," he whispered back then while placing that tiny baby into my arms. "I do not know how to do this without you." Funny how quickly people forget the hands that once held them together. After the photos ended, guests drifted toward the dessert table while soft pop music played through outdoor speakers hidden in the flower beds. I carried my untouched plate toward the kitchen, mostly because I needed a moment away from everyone staring without staring. The house smelled faintly of vanilla candles and barbecue smoke. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly against my skin. I set the paper plate beside the sink and noticed something odd almost immediately. The framed family photo that used to sit on the kitchen counter was gone. It had been taken 5 years earlier during a trip to Cape Cod. Daniel stood beside me in that picture with his arm around my shoulders while Chloe laughed between us wearing a bright yellow raincoat. Vanessa hated the photo because she said the wind made her hair look frizzy. I opened the cabinet for a glass of water and saw the frame shoved carelessly behind a stack of serving trays. Face turned backward. Hidden. My chest tightened quietly. Not dramatically. Just enough to hurt. "There you are." I turned to find Vanessa entering the kitchen carrying empty champagne flutes. Her smile appeared instantly when she saw me. "You disappeared," she said lightly. "I figured you might feel more comfortable inside. Team parties can be overwhelming." I looked at her carefully. Vanessa always spoke to me the way flight attendants speak to nervous passengers during turbulence. Calm. Controlled. slightly condescending. I was just getting water, I replied. She began rinsing glasses in the sink beside me. You know, she said casually, teenagers are sensitive at this age. Chloe gets embarrassed easily now. Everything feels dramatic to her generation. There it was. Not an apology. A warning. I set down the glass slowly. Embarrassed by what exactly? Vanessa shrugged one shoulder without looking at me. You can be intense sometimes, Margaret. Emotional. Chloe is trying to fit in socially, and honestly, teenage girls notice everything. I stared at the woman standing beside me in her expensive pink dress and diamond earrings that Daniel absolutely could not afford on his own salary. For years I had convinced myself Vanessa was simply difficult, particular, maybe insecure. But standing there in that cold kitchen while laughter drifted through the open patio doors, I finally saw something else entirely. She enjoyed diminishing people, especially people who threatened her control over the room. I see, I said. Softly. Vanessa dried her hands with a dish towel and smiled again. Good. I am glad we understand each other. Then she walked back outside without another word. I remained in the kitchen for a long moment staring at the hidden family photograph behind the trays. One memory after another began rising quietly in my mind like objects surfacing underwater. The Christmas dinner where Vanessa accidentally forgot to tell me they changed restaurants. The school recital where my seat had somehow been given away. The Thanksgiving where I arrived carrying homemade pies only to discover they had already eaten hours earlier. Every incident had seemed small on its own, forgettable, easy to excuse. But suddenly the pattern became impossible to ignore. This had never been carelessness. It had been a slow removal, piece by piece, year after year, until eventually I became someone who could stand beneath an insulting banner at her own granddaughter's birthday party, while nobody thought it unusual at all. I should have left then. Any reasonable person probably would have. But there is something strange about humiliation when it comes from family. Part of you keeps waiting for someone to fix it. One person to say, this is wrong. One person to pull you aside and admit the cruelty has gone too far. So I stayed. I walked back outside carrying my glass of water, while the sun slowly dipped lower behind the trees lining Daniel's backyard. The string lights overhead had started glowing softly against the early evening sky, and guests gathered around tall patio heaters even though the air was still warm. Everything looked beautiful from a distance. That was Vanessa's specialty. Beautiful surfaces. Perfect photographs. Rot hidden underneath. I noticed Chloe sitting alone near the edge of the pool scrolling through her phone, while her friends crowded around the dessert table taking pictures for social media. For a moment she looked younger again. Tired. Uncomfortable. I almost walked over to her, but before I could move, a teenage boy carrying a tray of sodas brushed past me too quickly and one of the cups tipped over the front of my blouse. Cola splashed across the pale blue fabric and dripped onto my white pants. Oh my God, I am so sorry, he stammered immediately, his face turning red with embarrassment. It is okay, I assured him gently while reaching for napkins from a nearby table. Accidents happen. But before the poor boy could even relax, Vanessa appeared beside us as if she had been waiting nearby. Maybe we should get Margaret cleaned up before pictures continue, she announced loudly. Several guests turned to look. We do not want stains in the family photos. Family photos. The ones I was apparently not part of. I dabbed quietly at my blouse while Vanessa continued smiling at guests like a pageant host managing a minor inconvenience. Then I heard it. Laughter. Soft at first. Teenage laughter from somewhere behind me. One girl whispered. Maybe the sign was right. More giggling followed. My hand stopped moving against the napkin. I did not turn around immediately. I think part of me was afraid to see Chloe laughing too. Slowly, I looked toward the group near the patio chairs. 3 girls stood there holding phones, trying badly to hide their amusement. One of them glanced nervously toward Chloe. Chloe lowered her eyes to the ground without saying a word. That silence hurt more than the banner ever could. Because silence means permission. Silence means the cruel thing gets to stay alive in the room. Daniel finally approached then, though not because of the laughter. He noticed the soda stain. Mom, maybe you should head home and change, he suggested quietly. You seem uncomfortable. I stared at my son for several seconds. At the man who once drove through a snowstorm at 2 in the morning, because I casually mentioned over the phone that my furnace sounded strange. The man who used to bring me tulips every Easter after his father died because he knew spring felt lonely without him. Somewhere along the line, that man had disappeared. Or maybe he had simply gotten tired. Tired people stop resisting stronger personalities. Tired people convince themselves silence is peace. I am fine, I said calmly. Daniel nodded too quickly, relieved I was not making a scene. Then his phone buzzed, and within seconds his attention drifted somewhere else entirely. I watched him walk back toward Vanessa while she adjusted his collar affectionately for another photo. They looked like one of those couples from luxury real estate advertisements. Attractive, relaxed, effortlessly polished. Nobody seeing them tonight would ever imagine they had spent years slowly teaching an old woman she no longer belonged inside her own family. A few minutes later, I finally sat down in a folding chair near the fence. Not because I was tired, because I needed to think. And that was when I noticed something strange hanging halfway out of Chloe's open backpack beside the patio door. A printed sheet of paper. At the top, in large bold letters, were the words, Operation Grandma Exit. I stared at the paper sticking halfway out of Chloe's backpack, while the sounds of the party blurred around me. Laughter drifted across the yard. Glasses clinked softly near the patio bar. Somewhere behind me, Vanessa was complimenting the caterer in that polished voice she used whenever other people were watching. But all I could see were those 3 words printed in bold black letters. Operation Grandma Exit. At first, I honestly thought it had to be a joke from social media. Teenagers named group chats ridiculous things all the time. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the humiliation of the evening had finally gotten to me. But then a breeze lifted the edge of the paper slightly, and I saw bullet points underneath the title. Move family photos. Ignore emotional reactions. No extra seat at main table. My stomach tightened so sharply I had to grip the edge of the folding chair beside me. This was planned. Not casually. Not impulsively. Carefully. Methodically. I glanced around the yard instinctively, half expecting someone to snatch the paper away before I could read more. But nobody was paying attention to me anymore. That was the strange thing about being slowly erased from a family. Eventually people stopped monitoring your feelings because they assumed you no longer mattered enough to react. Slowly, I stood up and walked toward the patio door. My heartbeat sounded unnaturally loud inside my chest, though my face remained calm. Years ago, after my husband Walter passed away from a stroke, I learned something important about grief. The deepest pain does not always make you cry. Sometimes it simply sharpens your vision. I reached the backpack just as Chloe stepped inside from the yard carrying a tray of empty soda cans. She froze the moment she saw me standing there beside her bag. Her eyes immediately darted toward the paper. "Grandma," she said quietly, almost breathless. I looked at her carefully. Really looked at her. She still had the tiny scar above her eyebrow from when she fell off her bicycle at age 9 while I ran barefoot across my driveway to pick her up before she even started crying. Back then, she used to reach for me automatically whenever she got hurt. Now she looked terrified of what I might say. "What is this?" I asked softly, touching the edge of the paper with one finger. Chloe swallowed hard. "It is stupid," she whispered quickly. "It was just a joke for the party." "A joke," I repeated. She nodded too fast. "Mom did not mean it seriously." "Mom." "Not Vanessa." "Not she." "Mom." I noticed her hands trembling slightly around the aluminum cans. "Did you?" I asked gently. Chloe's eyes filled immediately, which told me everything before she even spoke. "I did not make the sign," she whispered. "I swear." I believed her. That was the heartbreaking part. Chloe was not cruel by nature. She was becoming cruel by environment. There is a difference. Before I could respond, footsteps clicked sharply across the kitchen tile behind us. Vanessa appeared in the doorway holding her wine glass, her smile disappearing the second she saw the paper in my hand. For one brief moment, her entire face hardened. Cold. Calculating. Then the smile returned instantly. "Oh, honestly," she sighed dramatically. "Are we really doing this tonight?" Chloe lowered her head immediately. Vanessa stepped forward smoothly and took the paper from my fingers. "Teenagers create ridiculous party plans," she said lightly. "You know how children are." I kept my eyes on her. Children usually learn behavior from adults. The silence that followed was thin and dangerous. Vanessa took a slow sip of wine without breaking. Eye contact. Margaret, she said softly, sometimes people distance themselves because they are exhausted, not because they are cruel. Behind her, through the open patio doors, I could see Daniel laughing at something one of the guests said, completely unaware. Or pretending to be. I suddenly realized something then that chilled me far more than the banner ever could. Vanessa did not seem nervous anymore. She seemed confident. Confident people only behave that way when they believe they already control the outcome. I left the party 20 minutes later without saying goodbye to anyone except Chloe. She stood near the front walkway holding the silver bracelet box against her chest, while guests continued laughing behind her beneath the patio lights. For a second, she looked like she wanted to say something important, something honest. But honesty is difficult for children raised inside carefully controlled homes. "Thank you for the bracelet," she whispered quietly. I smiled at her. A real smile this time. "You are welcome, sweetheart." She hesitated before adding, "I did not know about the sign until today." I believed her again. But I also noticed she never said she tried to stop it. There was a difference between innocence and silence. One still leaves damage behind. The drive home felt strangely calm. The roads were nearly empty except for a few pickup trucks and late evening traffic drifting through town beneath orange streetlights. I rolled the windows down slightly and let the warm summer air move through the car while my thoughts settled into place one memory at a time. Vanessa was right about one thing. People do distance themselves when they become exhausted. But I was no longer exhausted. I was awake. My house greeted me with silence when I stepped inside. Not lonely silence. Peaceful silence. The kind that allows you to hear yourself think clearly after years of noise. I placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter and stared at the framed photograph above the fireplace. Walter smiling beside me during our 35th wedding anniversary dinner. He used to say something whenever Daniel disappointed me. "People reveal themselves slowly, Maggie. That is why betrayal feels sudden. You only notice it all at once." At the time I thought he sounded cynical. Now I understood exactly what he meant. I changed out of my stained blouse, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat down at the dining room table with my laptop. Then I did something I should have done years earlier. I stopped protecting everyone else's comfort. I opened the family phone account first. Daniel had convinced me to keep the shared plan after Walter died because it was simpler for billing. Over the years I barely looked at the statements. That night I examined every line carefully. Hundreds of dollars charged monthly to accounts I did not recognize. Subscription services. Shopping memberships. Luxury retail purchases linked through automatic payment systems attached to my name. My fingers grew still on the keyboard. Vanessa had access to the account years ago when she helped organize family finances after Walter's funeral. I opened another folder. Then another. Slowly a pattern emerged. Small charges first. Then larger ones. Quiet enough to avoid attention. Predictable enough to become normal. My chest tightened again, though not from sadness this time. Clarity can feel cold when it finally arrives. Around midnight, I walked upstairs to the hallway closet and pulled down the small fireproof lockbox Walter always insisted we keep. Inside were property documents, trust papers, insurance information, and copies of Chloe's education fund records. I carried everything downstairs and spread the papers carefully across the dining room table beneath the overhead light. The trust account balance made my stomach drop. Nearly $70,000 was missing compared to the last statement I remembered reviewing 2 years earlier. I checked again, slower this time. The withdrawals had started shortly after Vanessa began handling family scheduling and financial paperwork for Daniel while he focused on work. Renovation transfers. Temporary reallocations. Emergency reimbursements. All signed electronically. My eyes narrowed slowly at the screen. Daniel hated paperwork. He signed things constantly without reading them. Suddenly the expensive handbags. The luxury vacations. The diamond earrings. None of it looked accidental anymore. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the dark dining room window while the clock ticked softly against the wall. Hours earlier, I had arrived at a birthday party thinking my biggest pain was emotional humiliation. But humiliation was only the surface. Beneath it sat something far uglier. Something financial. Intentional. Carefully hidden behind years of family smiles and polished holiday photographs. And for the first time all evening, I finally understood why Vanessa looked so confident. I barely slept that night. Not because I was emotional anymore, but because my mind would not stop connecting pieces I had ignored for too long. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanessa standing in the kitchen holding her wine glass with that calm expression on her face. Not worried. Not defensive. Certain. People only become that certain when they believe nobody will ever challenge them. Around 6 in the morning, I made coffee and carried my files onto the back porch while the neighborhood slowly woke around me. Sprinklers clicked across fresh green lawns. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice before falling silent again. Everything looked ordinary. That was the strange thing about betrayal. The world continues behaving normally, while your understanding of it completely changes. I spent the next 3 hours organizing documents across my patio table. Phone statements. Trust withdrawals. Property records. Walter used to joke that I treated paperwork like museum archives. Every receipt labeled. Every account documented. At the time, Daniel teased me for being old-fashioned. Nobody keeps paper copies anymore, Mom. Thank God I did. By mid-morning, a very clear timeline had started forming in front of me. The first unusual withdrawal from Chloe's trust account happened 6 months after Walter died. $5,000 marked as temporary educational adjustment. Then another $8,000. Then 12. The electronic signatures attached to the forms carried Daniel's name, but I recognized the language immediately. Vanessa wrote like that. Overly polished. Corporate sounding. Daniel still typed emails the same way he did in college. Short sentences. Missing commas. Half-finished thoughts. He had not written those requests. Around noon, I called someone I had not spoken to in nearly a year. Harold Bennett answered on the third ring. Margaret Holloway, he said warmly. Well, now this is a pleasant surprise. Harold had been Walter's attorney for over 20 years before partially retiring. After Walter passed, I stopped reaching out because dealing with legal matters made everything feel painfully final. Harold, I said calmly, I need to review some family trust records with you. There was a brief pause on the line. Not suspicious. Concerned. Of course, he replied gently. Is everything all right? I looked down at the paperwork spread across the patio table while sunlight moved slowly across the pages. No, I admitted quietly. I do not believe it is. We arranged to meet the following morning at his office downtown. After hanging up, I sat very still for a long moment listening to the faint hum of cicadas in the trees behind my yard. Then my phone buzzed with an incoming text from Daniel. Hope you made it home okay last night. Sorry things got awkward. Awkward. That word sat on the screen like an insult all by itself. Not cruel. Not humiliating. Not unacceptable. Awkward. As though the evening had merely suffered from bad weather or uncomfortable seating arrangements instead of deliberate public humiliation beneath a banner telling me to go away. A second message appeared almost immediately afterward. Vanessa thinks maybe everyone was just overtired. I stared at the phone for several seconds before setting it face down on the table without replying. Overtired people forget birthdays. Overtired people burn dinner or miss appointments. They do not create organized plans called Operation Grandma Exit. They do not quietly remove $70,000 from a teenage girl's trust fund. Around 4 that afternoon, someone knocked softly at my front door. I opened it expecting a package delivery, and froze slightly when I saw Chloe standing there alone in yesterday's birthday dress. Her makeup was gone. So was the confidence she wore around her friends. She looked 15 again. Nervous. Guilty. Young. Mom thinks you are mad at me, she said quietly before I could speak. I studied my granddaughter carefully. Are you asking if I am? Chloe lowered her eyes immediately. Then, after several painful seconds, she whispered something so softly I almost did not hear it. I did not know she was taking money. The air between us suddenly felt very still. Because until that moment, I had not told a single person what I discovered the night before. For a moment, neither of us moved. Chloe stood in my doorway clutching the strap of her purse with both hands while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor behind her. I felt the same strange sensation I had experienced the night before while reading those trust statements. Not shock anymore. Confirmation. "Come inside," I said quietly. Chloe followed me into the kitchen without speaking. She sat at the table slowly, like someone entering a principal's office after already knowing they were in trouble. I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and placed one in front of her. Her fingers wrapped around the glass immediately even though she did not drink. "Tell me what you meant," I said calmly. Chloe stared down at the table for several seconds before speaking. "I overheard Mom talking on the phone a few weeks ago," she admitted softly. "She said if you ever checked the trust account, Dad would take the blame because he signs everything without reading it." My chest tightened again, though my face remained still. "Did Daniel know about the withdrawals?" Chloe shook her head immediately. "I do not think so. Mom handles all the money stuff now." I leaned back slowly in my chair. That sounded exactly right. Vanessa had not married Daniel because he was strong. She married him because he was easy to direct, easy to overwhelm, easy to convince that avoiding conflict was kindness. Chloe finally looked up at me then, her eyes glassy with guilt. "Grandma, I swear I did not know it was my college money." "But you knew something was wrong," I said gently. Tears filled her eyes almost instantly. "I tried to tell Mom the sign was mean," she whispered. "She said you always make yourself the victim, and that people were tired of your drama." I closed my eyes briefly. Not because her words surprised me, but because I suddenly understood how long Vanessa had been shaping the narrative around me inside that house. Little comments, tiny insults disguised as jokes, repeated often enough to become truth in everyone else's mind. "Do you know what emotional manipulation is?" I asked quietly. Chloe hesitated before shaking her head. "It is when someone slowly changes the way you see another person until you stop trusting your own instincts." The kitchen fell silent again except for the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Chloe whispered, "Did she do that to Dad too?" I looked toward the window overlooking my backyard where Walter used to grow tomatoes every summer in crooked wooden planters he built himself. "I think your father stopped noticing it because it happened little by little," I admitted softly. Chloe wiped quickly beneath her eyes. "Grandma, there is something else." Her voice dropped lower. "Mom has been talking about selling your house." I felt my fingers grow still against the side of my glass. "What?" Chloe swallowed hard. "She said after the holidays she wants Dad to convince you to move into one of those retirement communities outside Denver, because the house is too big for one person." For several seconds I simply stared at her. Not angry. Not emotional. Clear. Crystal clear. Walter built this house 41 years earlier with his own hands, helping contractors every weekend because we could not afford custom labor at the time. Daniel took his first steps in the living room beside the fireplace. Chloe learned how to bake cookies in my kitchen standing on a wooden stool Walter painted yellow for her 8th birthday. And somewhere over the past few years, Vanessa had quietly transformed my life into a real estate opportunity. "Did your father agree with this?" I asked carefully. Chloe hesitated long enough to answer without words. "He said it might be safer for you," she whispered finally. Safer. Funny how easily people hide betrayal inside concern. I stood slowly and walked toward the counter where my phone rested beside the stack of trust documents. Then I picked it up and dialed Harold Bennett's office. Chloe watched me nervously while the line rang. "Harold," I said calmly when he answered, "I would like to move our meeting to this afternoon if possible." There was a brief pause. "Of course," he replied carefully. "Is it urgent?" I looked directly at the folder containing the trust statements, property deeds, and account transfers spread across my dining room table. Then I glanced back at my granddaughter sitting silently in my kitchen looking far too young to carry this much guilt. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I believe it is." Harold Bennett did not look surprised when I placed the folders across his conference table the following afternoon. Concerned, yes. Angry eventually, but not surprised. His office smelled faintly of leather books and coffee, exactly the same way it had when Walter and I first sat there decades earlier signing life insurance papers after Daniel was born. Back then, we believed careful planning could protect a family from hardship. We never considered needing protection from the family itself. Harold adjusted his glasses slowly while reviewing the account transfers in silence. The only sounds in the room were pages turning and the ticking of the brass clock mounted behind his desk. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, he leaned back heavily in his chair. "Margaret," he said carefully, "these withdrawals should never have been approved without direct secondary authorization from the trustee." "Which is me," I replied quietly. Harold nodded once. "Yes." I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "Can the accounts be frozen?" "Immediately." "Do it." He studied me for a long moment after that, probably expecting tears, anger, shock. But grief changes people in strange ways. After losing Walter, I learned how to survive silence. This was simply a different kind of funeral. By early evening, every shared financial account connected to my name had been restricted pending investigation. Chloe's remaining trust funds were transferred into protected management under Harold's supervision. Access permissions were revoked. Property documents updated. Medical authority forms revised. It all happened quietly. No screaming. No dramatic confrontations. Just signatures. Calm voices. Consequences. Around 7 that evening, my phone finally rang. "Daniel." I stared at his name across the screen for several seconds before answering. "Mom," he said immediately, breathless with confusion. "What is going on?" "The bank froze our accounts." "Our accounts?" Interesting choice of words. "You should ask Vanessa," I replied calmly. Silence filled the line for 2 long seconds. "What does that mean?" he asked carefully. I looked out the window toward my backyard where the evening sky had faded into deep blue. "It means your wife has been stealing from your daughter." Another silence. This one heavier. "That is impossible," Daniel whispered finally. But he did not sound certain. He sounded terrified. "Harold Bennett has copies of the records," I continued evenly. "You should review them before speaking to me again." Then I hung up. My hands did not shake afterward. That surprised me most of all. About an hour later, headlights swept across my living room curtains. I already knew who it was before the doorbell rang. Vanessa stood on my porch wearing cream-colored slacks and a cashmere sweater despite the summer heat. She looked polished as always, but her composure had finally cracked around the eyes. "You froze everything," she said the second I opened the door. Not hello. Not explanation. Accusation. "Yes," I answered simply. Vanessa let out a short disbelieving laugh. "Do you have any idea what kind of damage you are causing right now?" I almost smiled at that. Damage. Such an interesting word from someone who spent years dismantling another person piece by piece. "You used Chloe's education fund," I said quietly. "You manipulated my son. And you tried to push me out of my own home." Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "Daniel was overwhelmed after Walter died. Somebody had to take control." There it was at last. The truth beneath all the polished smiles. She did not believe she had done anything wrong. She believed she deserved control. "You made everyone think I was unstable," I said softly. "Difficult. Emotional." Vanessa looked away first. Only for a second, but long enough. "People believed it because you made it easy," she muttered quietly. I studied her face carefully then. Not with hatred. Not even anger anymore. Just clarity. Vanessa had spent years trying to erase me from my own family photograph because my presence reminded her that some bonds existed long before she arrived. "The banner told me to go away," I said calmly. "So I finally decided to stop protecting all of you from yourselves." Behind Vanessa, another car pulled slowly into my driveway. Daniel stepped out looking pale and exhausted. But before either of them could speak again, a second passenger emerged from the back seat holding the small blue bracelet box tightly against her chest. Chloe walked past her parents without hesitation and stopped beside me on the porch. Then very quietly she took my hand.